I'm going to speak on part one, and then you'll hear at the end of this, we are going to do a multi-year theme around here, and the theme is this: reintroducing the American church to a guy named Jesus Christ. And because the American church has been introduced to everything else, and it hasn't worked. And I want to begin, and I just want to warn you, this is going to be like taking a drink from a fire hose, okay? So occasionally I'm going to check in, and I'm going to say, are you still with me? And you will say, yes. Even if you're not, you'll wake up and say yes. So we're going to try this. Are you all still with me? Yes, good, okay? Because I have a lot of information to give you, and to me, this is critical stuff, okay? And I want to begin by saying this. I spent years and years working with teenagers over a lot of decades, and I think teenagers are in the same kind of trouble America's in. America, in my opinion, has never been in this bad a shape, at least that I remember. And if you take a look at especially youth culture and what's going on, it seems like every decade Americans have lost something really important that they couldn't afford to lose and have never gotten it back. So I want to unpack what some of those are. So just jot these in. In the 1950s, Americans by and large lost innocence. Americans lost, they were liberated by their parents, from their parents, by cars and music and movies. And for the first time ever, Hollywood sprung up and started shaping American values. And sometime in the 50s, by and large, America lost innocence. And would you agree, have never really gotten it back? Okay? Most kids that today grow up with information that is getting at them way too early that warps the possibility of any great value structure being developed, okay? Now, the 60s. Anybody were around during the 60s, okay? Anybody remember the 60s, okay? In the 60s, Americans lost authority. All respect for any authority went out the window. Matter of fact, the phrase in the 1960s was, don't trust anyone over 30, okay? Don't trust anyone. In other words, Americans lost authority, okay? Now, in the 1970s, that was the me decade, Americans lost love. Americans lost love. The 1970s, Americans got swept in. It was dominated by a focus on self-actualization, actually turned into self-absorption, and families in the 1970s came apart. It was the free love decade, and here's the deal, okay? Americans, especially teenagers, starving for love, settled for sex. That was a gift from the 1970s, and it's never stopped taking, okay? 1980s, how many of you were around for the 80s? Remember the 80s, okay? Here's what Americans lost in the 1980s, all sense of style. How many of you would agree with this, by the way, okay? And if you're wondering who is that in the middle, he's on tonight. His name is Lincoln Brewster. And that is non-Photoshop journey days. In the 1980s, Americans lost values. They lost values. And they really started caring about nothing other than themselves and how much stuff they had and about how much stuff they owned. A movie that summarized the entire thing was called Wall Street. The main character was a guy named Gordon Gekko. And this was the catchphrase for the 80s. Here it is.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good.
And that was the 1980s, the perfect summary statement for an entire decade that told you it ought to be all about you, okay? Now, the 1990s, Americans lost faith. The 1990s, Americans lost faith. And the 90s, something happened in the heartland that shook everybody up. The Murrah Federal Building got bombed. Columbine happened. And all of a sudden, Americans who had a lot of faith in this country began to lose that faith. And it really came to a head in the 2000s. The last decade, what have Americans lost? Here it is, all sense of personal security. Americans have lost security. And the 2000s started with Y2K. Remember that? The big scare. I know people that sold their stuff and moved to the middle of nowhere. Yeah, I actually know some people. We weren't worried. How many of you had a minivan when you were raising kids, okay? We had enough French fries stuffed in the seats of our van. We could last the entire decade, okay? You started with Y2K. 9/11 followed Y2K. The economy then collapses. And so in the last 2 years, What are Americans now feeling like they've lost? Here it is. You summarize all this. Americans now have lost hope. Americans, by and large, have lost hope. The economy collapsed, and here's the question. People have stopped believing in their future. They have stopped believing in the future, and pollsters will say for the first time ever, parents are now predicting their kids' lives will not be as good as their lives. That's a first in America. And here's the problem. You take a look at all of these things: innocence, authority, love, values, faith, security, and hope. I actually believe this. You cannot be spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, or relationally healthy without those things. Would you agree? And here's the deal. No longer are American kids, teenagers, and adults able to get those things from our culture. So the million-dollar question is, where in the world are they going to get these things? Does that make sense? Okay? Because Americans are starving for innocence, in need of authority, whether they know it or not, starving for love, in need of values. Would you agree, by the way? We don't need more values clarification. We need values formation. Okay? Faith, security, some sense of hope. Nobody lives well or goes forward without these 7 things. They're essential to spiritual and psychological health. And the problem is this: no longer are they getting these things from our culture. So where in the world are they going to get them? Folks, you're sitting in the room. Look around. Just look at the people next to you. They're going to get it from you. It's why Jesus said these words: I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it. The gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I was at a conference in Chicago about 4 months ago, and it was a pastor's deal, and all these pastors are coming up, and in one way or another, they all asked the same question. And here's the question. They said, hey, how's your church doing? Is your church doing okay? And you've probably been asked this here. Hey, man, how's the church doing? Is the church doing okay? And that started me asking some questions, okay? Does God have expectations for what he wants to do in our churches? And are those just okay? And I started thinking about it, and the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what? Given these 7 things, just doing okay is no longer okay. Would you agree? And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, you know what? This verse, the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I actually want to ask a couple questions. Number one is doing okay, is settling for okay? Second question is this: who is your church's competition? Now, don't answer that, okay? Is it First Baptist, First Presbyterian, my favorite church name, Detroit, Michigan, First Church of God, number 2. Who's your church's competition? And I want to say this, for our church, we are not in competition with any other Christian church. Every other Christian church and Christian ministry is our partner and our ally, okay? We are not in competition with each other. We're all on the same team. However, we do have some competition, because Jesus said, hey, man, the gates of hell, who is our competition? Here it is. It's the gates of hell. And what I want to say is this: every time a child grows up in disadvantaged circumstances, in my opinion, hell wins. Every time a family is destroyed, hell wins. Every time a marriage explodes and breaks up and destroys the whole fabric of that home, hell wins. Every time American Christians settle for hoarding possessions and money instead of investing it in the kingdom of God and the expansion of God, in my opinion, hell wins. Every time a church settles for anything less than God has for it, hell wins. And folks, the church's job is not to grow, not to increase in numbers, not to have better looking stained glass. The Church of Jesus Christ, our job is to put hell out of business. That's our job. And what's interesting, though, is go to the first part of that verse. Jesus said this: I will build whose church? His church. I'll build my church. In other words, how do you reintroduce the American church to the Jesus who actually wants to retake over his own church and build his own church? And I'll give you an example of this. My wife and I, about a decade ago, were in South Africa, and we spoke all over in South Africa and trained pastors. And the longer we were there, the more depressed I got. And that's usually not the case. And And we were with the Dutch Reformed Church in South Africa, and they were the oppressors in the day in South Africa. Okay? And the longer I said, the more depressing it got, and it was one traditional dead thing after another, after another, after another. And I mean, they had territories, and you can't do this. And I mean, these pastors were frustrated. Youth pastors were going, this is a nightmare. And it was just one depressing, segregated congregation after another, after another, after another. And about the time I was ready to just give up and fly home, we were invited to fly up to Johannesburg, or Pretoria, and speak at the largest Dutch Reformed church in South Africa. And so we flew up there, and I was getting ready for another all-white, condemning, uptight, old-fashioned deal. I walked into their church, and it felt like Thrive. I couldn't believe it. And I mean, thousands of people and incredible stuff going on and a long worship service. And I'm sitting next to the pastor in this worship service. And then during worship, we stand up and we're worshiping. And I'm looking around and I'm going, they're leading music in English and in other languages. And this crowd, it's not all white. It's a mix of everybody, just like it should be. And it was a diverse crowd, and they're all singing, and they're all worshiping, and I finally couldn't take it anymore, and I elbowed the pastor, and I said, how long have you been here? And he said, about 10 years. And I said, I was trying to figure out how to ask this. I said, was it always like this? And he said, oh, no. I said, what was it like when you got here? He said, it was like all the rest. And I said, what happened? And he said, one meeting was all it took. He said, I met with our board. I put a chair at the head of the table for our board. And he said, nobody will ever sit in this chair again. That's Jesus' chair. He's the head of the church. He wants to be in charge of our church. We haven't done a very good job without him. Why don't we just give Jesus back his church? And you know what? He said, they all agreed. And then he said, so instead, he said, you know the worship wars? How many are familiar with that? Okay. He said, we didn't fight those. We just asked this question. What does Jesus want us to sing? And this is what he wants us to sing. When we build a children's building, he said, we didn't fight about it. He goes, we just kind of prayed and tried to search, what does Jesus want us to build for a children's building? And that's what he wanted us to do with kids. When we came up with the question, is this going to stay all white, or are we going to be welcoming? That was easy. What does Jesus want us to be? And then these people are standing up, they're singing, worshiping, I mean, all these different nationalities and backgrounds together, and we're standing there and worship, and he swept his arm over the entire thing while it's in worship, and he just looked at me and said, this is what Jesus wanted to do. And I think that's an interesting idea. Why don't we give Jesus back his church and let him get back in charge and start obeying him, okay? The problem is he tends to mess everything up. And so I am going to give you, I'm just going to give you the words of Jesus today and some implications for our churches. In other words, because I actually think the American church, we've been introduced to stained glass. We've been introduced to fancy board structures. We've been introduced to modern everything. We've been introduced to the emergent church. We've been introduced to traditional church. We've been introduced to liturgy. We've been introduced to candles. We've been into tucked or untucked shirts. I mean, we have been introduced to everything under the sun. I just want to reintroduce us to Jesus with some of his own words. So, are y'all still with me, by the way? Okay, good. So this may get a little convicting. If you get really convicted and upset, just assume this is for the person sitting next to you, not you. Okay, here we go. Okay, number one, I think the American church needs to be reintroduced to the Jesus who said all kinds of stuff like this. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works I've been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I'm going to the Father. And then we need to be reintroduced to the Jesus who said stuff like this. Hey, you can ask anything for my name and I'll do it. Okay? We need to be reintroduced to the Jesus who said things like this. Truly, I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move. Nothing will be, would you circle this whole phrase? Nothing will be impossible for you. Here's my problem. The minute I start reading that, I'm always going, oh yeah, what about this? What about that? We need to be reintroduced to the Jesus who says, with man, this is impossible. Every wife here is going, yep. With man, this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. We got to be reintroduced to the Jesus who believed impossible things were still possible. And let me give you an example of this. I've been very convicted in the last year because here's the deal. The secular world believes impossible things are possible, and we're the ones who are supposed to believe that, and we don't. And I came to grips with that when I read, this is the single, you're not gonna believe, the best leadership book I've read in 10 years is this book. Steve Jobs, Appearing at Thrive for the One and Only Time. And I read that book. How many of you have read it? Okay? It's long, it's well-researched, incredible. The first half of it, you can kind of toss it, Steve being Steve, doing acid and yelling at people, okay? But when he comes back to Apple, the rest of that book is some of the most challenging leadership stuff I've ever read in my life, okay? And as I'm reading this book, here's what dawned on me. Apple has vision for their future bigger than any church I'm aware of has. Apple has creativity way bigger than any church I'm aware of has. Apple's employees have passion for their cause that you almost never find in a lot of church people. Apple takes risks, has change agent things they do. They've got passion. Apple actually believes they can change the world. Most churches I know are going, we can't do that. It's not in the budget. And and you take almost anything, whether it's innovation, creativity, passion, sacrifice for all this kind of stuff. Apple is blowing the church away in almost every single area. And so I read Steve Jobs' books, and I basically started saying, isn't there anything we should learn from Apple? And you know what I realized is, they're believing the stuff we just read more than we are. Steve Jobs, first thing, I'm actually working on a book called What Should the Church Learn from Apple, of all things. And what dawned on me is this. Steve Jobs, you read carefully, he had a thing called the reality distortion field. And basically, he believed impossible things were possible. It may have had something to do with dropping acid. Who knows where it came from, but Steve believed impossible things were possible. So for example, one time he actually said this, he said, how many of you have ever seen a concept car, like at an auto show? Let me ask you, how many of you have seen a concept car? How many of you you saw a concept car and you went, that rocks? He goes, you go to an auto show, you see a concept car and you go, man, that rocks. And then you see the one that comes out 4 years later. And you go, in his words, that sucks. And he goes, the concept car rocks. The one that they came out with was pathetic. And then he says, what happened? They snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. He says, here's what happened. Some visionary dreamers said, we should do this. Then the finance people said, you can't do that. Change it. And the engineer said, that's impossible. You can't do that. Change it. Then, by the time it comes out 4 years, it's a pathetic thing that's watered down version and nobody really wants the thing. You know what's interesting is? He's right, isn't he? And I thought, that happens in every ministry. Got a vision from God. You can't do that. It's not that kind of stuff. When we actually changed here's what Steve Jobs' solution was. He said, I'm keeping everybody in the meetings. So he says, we have really messy meetings because we have the finance people and the engineers and the designers all in the same meeting, okay? But an engineer walked up to Steve. Steve said, I want to do a computer, but I want it to be in a box. Engineers walked up to Steve and said, that's impossible. You can't do that. And Steve said, do it anyway. And the engineer looked at Steve and said, you can't change the laws of engineering by wishful thinking. Steve said, yes, I can. Matter of fact, anybody got an iPhone in here? Watch this. Raise your hand if you have an iPhone. Okay, here, can I borrow one? I'll give it back, I promise. Oh, thanks, Steve. Okay, this is an iPhone, and Steve gets a big case on this thing. Let me take the case off. Okay, If you got an iPhone, take a look at your iPhone for a second, okay? And the front of your iPhone, the glass covers the entire thing. Here's what happened. You know why that's true? You know why basically everybody wants this? Is a month before they're going to start production, Steve calls the designer. And here was the original design was, they had the case wrapping over the glass. So the glass was inside in the case. Steve called the designer, and he called him and said, stop production. And he goes, what? That's going to cost me. He said, I don't care. Stop production. He goes, why? He goes, I don't love it yet. And the guy's like, okay. Matter of fact, it was a pretty cool thing. They asked the designer, what did you think of that? And he said, I wish I'd have thought of that myself. And so he met with the designer and said, here's the problem. I don't want the glass inside. I want the glass to cover the entire thing so it's far more intuitive. And they went, okay, but that glass doesn't exist. So Steve Jobs called the head of Corning Glass. He actually called the office and tried to get put through to Corning Glass. Okay? The head of Corning Glass, his secretary said, I'm sorry, if you want to talk to Mr. whoever the guy is, you'll have to make an appointment, and it takes, so they said, email us a response, and we'll hook you up. He's like, no, I'm Steve Jobs, put me through. I'm sorry, Mr. Jobs, you'll have to do this, all that kind of stuff. So Steve calls a friend of his that knows this guy and says, tell this moron to take my call. Okay? The guy doesn't call Steve, and gives Steve Jobs' cell. Instead of calling that, Steve calls Apple and says, I'd like to speak to Steve Jobs. He said, I'm sorry, if you want to speak to Steve Jobs, you'll have to submit it in writing. So the guy called his buddy back and said, he wouldn't take my call. Okay? Well, finally, they hook up. And Steve says, I got this vision. I want this glass over here. And the guy says, well, it doesn't exist. And he said, yeah, but it could exist. And he says, the only thing we've ever had like it in the 1960s, we had a thing called Gorilla Glass. And it was a really thick glass, kind of a military application thing. And it's kind of what you're looking for, but, you know, that was the 1960s. He basically goes, it doesn't exist anymore. Steve said, well, make it. I want all you can make in 6 months. And the guy said, that's impossible. We don't have any factory. Steve said, it's possible. Let me tell you how. He stands up. The guy says, shut up. You don't know anything about glass. Let me tell you. Here's how it's done. And finally, Steve said, I don't care. He said, this has to be done in 6 months. It has to be done. The guy said, it's impossible. You ready? Give me a round of applause for Mr. Trusting Steve Brown. Every single piece of glass on your iPhone or your iPad is Gorilla Glass, and it was delivered in slightly under 6 months. And I'm starting to read this stuff about Steve Jobs, and I'm going, he believed impossible things were possible. We are so stuck and mired in discouragement and budgets and boards and process and all that kind of stuff. We're the ones who are supposed to believe the words of Jesus, that impossible things are possible. He believes it, we don't. Does that convict anybody else in here? And one of my favorites is the guy, my main mentor over the last decade, Glenn Cole, 78 years old, fired up guy. He died about 3 months ago. Massive heart attack. But I mean, he ran to the tape. Glenn called me one day, and he said, hey, I got tickets to a movie, man. Let's you and your wife and my wife and I go. So I hop in, we drive. We're in the front seat, women are in the back. We're driving, and Glenn starts telling me the story of Capital Christian here in Sacramento. And he says, man, it was incredible. He goes, you know, by the way, do we have any pastors here? How many of your pastors? Because here, when they train you in seminary, they say, when you go to a church for the first year or two, don't change anything, okay? Glenn goes, I moved into town, and 30 days after being there, we had a vote. We voted to change the name of our church, moved to change the location of our church, and change all the bylaws of the church. It took 2 hours and 5 minutes, and there was almost no negative votes. And I went, how'd that happen? And Steve said, well, there's a guy in the church, and he said, man, if you're going to move the church, he goes, I got 70 acres out on a prime frontage off of Highway 50. You ought to buy this acreage. And and Glenn Cole says to the guy, he says, well, how much? And the guy, millions. And he said to him, you should just give it to our ministry. I said, Glenn, what happened? He said, he hung up on me. And he said, I got a call the next day, and the guy said, all right, it's yours. I'm giving it to you. Glenn said, he said, I only said one thing on the phone, hallelujah. And then Glenn, we're driving to a movie, and Glenn turns into sermon mentor mode with me, and he looks at me and he says, you know why that vote happened in 30 days? Nobody votes against a miracle. Nobody votes against a miracle. And he said, and you know what's wrong with the church these days? The church these days is operating without Jesus and without his miracles. And what the church in America today needs is more miracles. We need more God stuff going on. We need more miracles. In other words, we need to recapture the Jesus who said, with man, it's impossible. But not with God, all things are possible with God. By the way, it's what I hope happens at Thrive. Or I hope what happens is some of you walk in here and go in conversation with other pastors, seminars, you're going, wow, maybe God's not done working in our church. Maybe God wants to do this and this and this and this. And you walk out of here filled with a whole bunch of other things that aren't in your budget. Okay, number one is this. We need to be reintroduced to Jesus who said, man, all things are possible. Second is this. We need to be reintroduced to a second Jesus that American churches are good at ignoring that said this. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Would you say that out loud with me? The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Jesus had a personal mission statement. Here it was. He says, here's why I came, to seek and save the lost, okay? And you know what the problem with that is? And he says, hey, you're going to become fishers of men. Most American churches have stopped fishing for men. They are just keepers of the aquarium, okay? And it's tragic what's going on in American churches. I'm actually convinced these days that if Jesus moved to almost any community in America and he started a church and he hung up a sign outside saying, we've come to seek and save the lost, within a matter of months, a lot of the mature, deep Christians in that community would be running around going, whatever you do, don't go to Jesus' church. He's shallow. It's one of those seeker shallow deals. You should come to our church where it's deep. Don't go to Jesus' shallow church. That would happen. By the way, that's also happening in almost every community in America right now. Okay? Matter of fact, let me put a couple words up here. There is a big divide in our country, and there's a tension. By the way, 89% of churches, 89% of people in our region are not going to any church. Raise your hand if it's similar in your area, okay? Roughly 9 out of 10 people. You know the problem with this? Nobody cares. Hey, if 90% of the people in Granite Bay were keeping their kids out of the Granite Bay schools, what would happen? Everybody's alarm bells would go off. They would ask, why are we not effective? And they would change everything to become more effective. 90% of people are avoiding Christian churches like the plague. Nobody's alarm bells ever go off. And instead, here's what everybody's battling over. It's reach and teach. And in every community in America, there is now a battle between churches that reach and churches that teach, okay? And churches that reach are saying, hey, we are the relevant ones. We go after lost people. We want to lead people to faith in Christ. We want to go after the unchurched in our community, okay? Churches that teach are going, no. We don't want to reach people. Once they start tithing, we'd be happy to steal them because we teach deep, okay? In other words, we're like the deep place. They are like the shallow place. Raise your hand if you've heard this in your community, okay? It's all over America. Matter of fact, it's one of Andy Stanley in Atlanta, one of the best Bible teachers on the planet, has had to defend himself twice in the last 3 months publicly on this issue. Matter of fact, a couple months ago, Andy Stanley finally stood up and said, I'm not shallow. I'm clear. Is that awesome or what? And this, we basically went, this is not good for America, is it? Okay? Because what happens is this. Everybody's afraid to reach people because you're going to get labeled as the shallow thing like Jesus. And so we started thinking it through. We brought in an outside consulting firm. We actually spent 6 months going, what is God saying to us about this? And we finally realized settling for one without the other isn't healthy. Okay? Because here's the deal. When you reach, your church ends up growing. When you teach, your church ends up healthy. And we think long-term, you're both or you're neither. Does that make sense? And so we basically came out with something that looks like this, okay? We basically studied Ephesians, how wide and deep is the love of Christ, and we rewrote every single thing we're doing. And we basically said our church needs to reach wide. Second, we need to teach deep. And we actually went to a board. I got chills writing this. Man, God is telling us reach wide and teach deep and do both, okay? And then we looked at that and we went, you know what? Something's missing. Because we went back to what are the nature of God? What is the main way God is described in the Bible? Okay, and here it is. God's a God of grace, therefore we have to reach wide. God is a God of truth, therefore we have to teach deep. But we also went, God's a God of love. Grace, truth, and love. 3 major descriptors of God in the Bible. And we went, we have a third one, and every church is incomplete without it. And here it is. We've got to unleash compassion. We've got to unleash compassion. And we also realized, here's the deal, it's a cycle. What happens is, if we reach wide, then we have people that we can teach deep. But the mark you are deep is that you unleash compassion, not that you have a longer list of things you're against and you become more judgmental. Does that make sense? There is a shallow definition of deep. Matter of fact, in my opinion, deep has become the new shallow in America. And here's one of the reasons 9 out of 10 people avoid the Christian church like the plague. Christianity and Christians are very unpopular. Less than half the people who like Jesus like Christians. And here's why. American Christians are viewed as the teach deep, opinionated people who are against everything. They are not viewed as the unleash compassion people. And if we would ever get this right, if we would ever go reach wide, teach deep, but the mark your deep is you're unleashing compassion, we would be viewed for the first time in decades as the unleashed compassion people, and it would heal people's views of Jesus and Christianity and church if we ever got this one right. And we'd finally be viewed as the compassion people, not just the deep people who have laundries of things they're against. Okay? Does this make sense, by the way? And now, if you're looking for more theological words, those of you pastors that were seminary trained, here we go, okay? Basically, when you reach wide, you're evangelical. When you teach deep, that's transformational. And when you're unleash compassion, that's missional. In other words, our goal is to save lives, change lives, and unleash everybody. Does that make sense? Okay? And we actually took a long look at that and said, this is what really matters. Because I actually think there is nothing like a church when it's operating, and we actually believe this, every church is called to follow Jesus. And if you're going to follow Jesus, you have to go where he is going. And where he is going is, in his own words, to seek and save the lost. And by the way, it's a whole lot more fun to do ministry that way. It happened a few years ago. I'm in our services, and I look down, and in the front row is the biggest guy I've ever seen in church. He's taken up 2 chairs, and I knew it was his first time at Bayside because he had a tie on. And it's like the Hulk has come to church. Well, sitting next to him, taking up 2 chairs, is another huge guy, not as big as the Hulk, but he's a football coach and he's a Christian. I know him, okay? And so at the end of that message, we gave an invitation, and I looked down, and the Hulk has raised his paw, indicating he's prayed and received Christ as Savior and Lord, okay? And it was interesting. So at the end of the service, I kind of keep my eye on him, and I watch him. And we have like these tables called I Raise My Hand. People go get follow-up material, and I watch him. He goes over to the I Raise My Hand table, who is staffed by a former LAPD cop. Couldn't have been better, okay? And so that's the 9:30 service. The 11:30 service, a guy comes running in, and he grabs him, and he goes, the football coach, running back, and he goes, hey, did you see the guy that was with me this morning? And I go, yeah, how do you miss him? He goes, do you know who that is? And I said, I got no idea. He said, he is the largest bouncer at the biggest nude bar in Sacramento. And I said, how do you know that? Whole nother story. 2 weeks later, he quit his job. How many of you think that's probably a good idea if he's going to walk effectively with Jesus? Okay? Reach wide, teach deep, unleash compassion, okay? And we have got to get back to listening to Jesus instead of people with a shallow, superficial vision of what deep is while they're ignoring the words of Jesus' own purpose statement. That makes sense? Okay? I know this is not popular these days. You go reach people for Christ, you'll get criticized. Jesus did, and he was criticized by the religious elite and teachers of the day. There's a third thing we need to begin to listen. Here it is. We need to be reintroduced to the Jesus who said this: "Let the little children come to me, and don't hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these." I've been making a list of stuff that the church can get wrong, and it's by and large probably okay. Here it is: stained glass, org chart, style of music, church architecture, almost everything else, misspelling in the bulletin, misspelling on the overheads, parking screw-ups. We can get almost everything else wrong. There is one thing we can't get wrong, and here it is: kids. There's one thing we cannot get wrong. And here's the problem. How many of you went to seminary? Okay, you'll have 2 years of church history, you'll have a full year of Greek, you'll have some Hebrew, you'll have, you can graduate from seminary without ever taking one class having anything to do with children or teenagers. Who trains these people? And what's interesting about this is, you think about it, I wrote a couple lines in there. Here's the problem. If your church and my church, if we lose the kids, we lose three things. Number one, we lose the community. We lose the community. Because here's the deal. Whoever wins the kids wins the community. Second is, if we lose kids, we lose the culture, because they're going to end up shaping the culture. They actually already are. Third, you lose the kids, you lose the future. Whoever wins the kids wins the community, the culture, and the future. Now, what's the quickest way to make sure I lose kids? Here it is. Ignore young leaders. And make sure everything's in the hands of 40-year-olds and above, and that everybody young is never in any strategic meetings, never on any church boards, never in any, we threw our staff meetings out a few years ago and restocked them with everything, so we basically took everybody 20 and something and threw them all in the room. Makes life very uncomfortable. They come with these wild ideas. And then I have to go back to number one. Okay, it's not impossible, it's even though it's not in the budget. And here's the problem. Here's the deal. If we ignore young leaders, we lose three things. We lose the right to create the community. Second, we lose the right to influence culture. Third, we lose the right to shape the future. If we lose the stuff with kids, we lose everything. I got so convicted about this about a year ago. I started thinking, man, that phrase, teenagers are the church of tomorrow, that is not in the Bible anywhere I can find. Anywhere where Jesus said, come, follow me, tomorrow's fine. Come serve me, tomorrow will be okay. It's not in there. I started thinking, man, we got to call kids and teenagers into service right now. And let me give you an example of that. This is the coolest kid you will ever see, just a kid. But this kid is being developed, discipled, and making an impact. And by the way, you're going to fall in love with this kid. I've been trying to adopt it. I can't find him. Check this out.
Hey church, my name's Ben. I just want to share with you an awesome praise report. I felt very impacted to take on one of those children, but I knew I wouldn't be able to finance it. So I went home and made up a pamphlet for dog walking. It first started with me delivering it to the streets, then it went on to just the surrounding streets, and now it's gone as far as the surrounding suburbs. And then work started coming in. I was walking 2 dogs on school nights and up to 5 on Saturdays. And it just kept going up and up and up and up. And it didn't just stop there. Other people who didn't have dogs thought of other creative ways like sweeping I could do for them and other little odd chores. I really love to give them good customer service and get there 5 minutes early and end 5 minutes late. And I always make sure to tell them their dog's been very well behaved, even when it sometimes hasn't. Originally, I only ever planned to sponsor 1 child, but now I've got 2 fully paid for their first year. I also did some research on how a well can benefit a community, and I've saved a bit of money towards my first well. And then I'm hoping to sponsor my 3rd child and start raising money for my first orphanage. I just want to thank God for the love, favor, and blessings He's shown to me for the last few months in being able to bring in the money. So come on, church, let's give God the praise.
Wouldn't you agree the kingdom of God belongs to kids just like that? Okay, we ought to be calling our kids into that kind of stuff. I'll give you an example. About a year ago, I'm having a conversation with John Harris, one of our staff guys. We're on a plane ride back. And for years, it bothered me that the only religious organization on the planet that trains its future leaders, and Jesus spent the majority of his time training leaders, that trains its future leaders is the Mormon Church by putting them in full-time ministry. And we're on this plane, and finally, we said, why don't we do it? So we basically invented a thing called Apex. And we came in, we said, we know it's not in the budget, all this. I took a second offering to pay for the thing. Just got it in front of church, said, we're not spending a dime of this, all going to, we had applications, and we said, we are going to hire 40 teenagers, high school juniors and seniors, college freshmen and sophomores for the entire summer. We also told them, this is going to be like Marine Corps boot camp, football hell week, and you joined the church camp staff all at the same time. We own you. Don't apply unless you know we own you. There's interviews, all this kind of stuff. We're doing a discipleship retreat, 4-day thing. I did this myself. We're doing all this stuff. They're going to be in ministry. They're serving in every service, all this stuff. What happens is our staff comes in and says, here's the problem. We got 51 kids, and they all are killer. What do we do? And I went, hire them all. Nothing is impossible. And so took another second offering, and we hired 51 kids. I have never seen anything like it. I'm an old youth ministry guy. You study the statistic of what happens to teenagers spiritually, and then you take a look at the statistic of how those 51 kids have done this year. They're blowing the doors off of their campuses and all this. It's amazing what's going on. So this summer we said, let's amp it up a little bit. So we're hiring 100. Okay. And by the way, we met with the parents too. We said, parents, we're sorry, man. You won't see your kid this summer. We own them, so don't let your kids come, okay? Does this make sense? We have got to start investing in younger leaders. It is the only way we're going to win the community, win the culture, and win back the culture, and win the future, okay? There's a fourth thing Jesus said, and here it is. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, would you circle that? Is like a wise man who built his house on the rock, okay? And because I'm running out of time, I'll speak on this next year. We have got to get to the point where our Bible teaching is application-oriented instead of opinion-oriented. And what I mean by that is this. There are 3 relationships that denominations and churches and Christians have with the Bible. I'm just going to put them up right here. Some ignore it. We have entire denominations throwing out biblical mandates right now, okay? And other Christians, they're Christians, they never touch their Bibles, okay? Others, they know it, and some, they live it, okay? Here's the problem. A lot of people get stuck on number 2, okay? And here's what happens. When Christians get to know their Bibles, one of 2 things happens. They become more Pharisee-like or they become more Christ-like. Does that make sense? Some Christians, the more they're taught the Bible, and I'm for teaching it, the more it makes them worse. You ever met any of these people? Okay? In other words, it ought to make us more Christ-like rather than more Pharisee. I got to move on. Number 5, okay? We need to reintroduce American churches to the Jesus who said things like this. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. I want you to do me a favor. Turn to the person next to you and answer this question. What is the fastest growing religion in America? Ready? Go. Okay. Here it is. A guy named Christian Smith, he's a sociologist from Notre Dame, has written a new book, and Smith says this: the fastest growing religion in America isn't Christianity, it's not Buddhism, it's not Hinduism, it's not atheism. Here it is. Moralistic, therapeutic deism. Just say that to the person next to you. It's moralistic, therapeutic deism. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Now, moralistic, therapeutic deism is the fastest growing faith in our day. Now, it's characterized by certain, and here's the deal. Smith says this is so popular, it is getting embedded in people's mind. It is becoming their religion whether they know it or not. Okay? Now, what is this religion? Okay, it's kind of made up of three things, and they're all kind of fuzzy. Okay, and the first one is this: the religion is moralistic. In other words, God wants people to be good and wants people to be kind. That's kind of the moralism part. Now, what exactly does goodness look like? Well, that's kind of fuzzy. Okay, now, second word there is therapeutic. The central goal of this religion is to be happy and feel good about yourself. That's the therapeutic part. What exactly does appropriate human happiness look like? Well, that's kind of fuzzy, okay? Then, third word is deism, okay? God doesn't really need to be involved in my life on a daily basis, and God doesn't really place demands on me, okay? But he's available when needed to solve a problem. That's the deism part. How exactly does God honor me? That's a little bit fuzzy. And the last belief of moralistic therapeutic deism is this: who goes to heaven? Everybody goes to heaven when they die. Well, here's that: all good people go to heaven. Now, what exactly is good? Well, that's kind of fuzzy. That's moralistic therapeutic deism. That's the fastest growing faith in America today. And Smith says this, quote, "What's so dangerous about this religion is that for many, many people in Christian churches that think of themselves as Christians, what they're really living is moralistic therapeutic deism, where it's all about them." And that's not following Jesus. It's not biblical faith. It's not God-honoring living. It doesn't honor the Jesus who clashed with that faith by saying things like this. Check it out. Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to what? To, circle the word serve, and to give. We just had every kid in our church parade in and give money for 31 different causes. It was awesome. Carol Holt, our children's pastor, was telling me one of the kids was clutching his bank, and all the way up, it's a priceless, this kid's going, "I don't want to give Jesus my money." How many of you, watch this though, how many of you ever felt like that? I have, come on, admit it. The moralistic therapeutic deism says, hey, keep your money. You don't have to tithe, you don't have to sacrifice, you don't have to listen to these kind of tough stuff Jesus said. Or, notice what he said next, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross daily, and follow me. Jesus also made outrageous statements like this: whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. What does it profit a man or woman to gain the entire world and forfeit their soul? And American ministry models and New Testament ministry models are in an all-out clash right here. Because here's the deal. American ministry is consumer-driven. New Testament ministry is discipleship-driven. And American ministry is this. It's consumer-driven, so it's all about entertainment. It's all about entertainment. There's a lot of, hey, how entertaining can we be? Matter of fact, that's why, we're senior pastors, just senior pastors. Where are you? Okay, senior. Has anybody ever left your church and said, I'm leaving because I'm not being fed here? Just raise your hand if you ever heard somebody say, okay, you want to punch him for Jesus? I mean, now, what's interesting is this. If you are a consumer, you expect to go to church to be fed. If you're a disciple, you expect to go worship and learn and serve and be. Does this make sense? Okay. I also want to say to some of these people, has it ever occurred to you that you might, I don't know, want to take off your bib, get up out of the high chair, pick up a fork, and for once, feed yourself, okay? American ministry, consumer-driven entertainment. New Testament ministry was discipleship-driven, and it didn't focus on entertainment, it focused on equipping. It focused on equipping. Now, each one of these things, the Bible says you reap what you sow. So each one of these things is going to lead to a direct result. And here's the direct result. Entertainment leads to people being self-centered spectators that come and are fed or come and applaud, or they don't worship, they evaluate, okay? Self-centered spectators. Now, when you equip people, they become God-honoring servants. They become God-honoring servants. However, that means, people, We have got to shift people into calling them to obedience to Christ and discipleship with their time, with their money. We need to call people to sacrifice. We need to reintroduce American Christians to Jesus, who said stuff like, guess what? It's my money, not yours. Okay? And let me give you an example of that. 6 years ago, we did a thing around here called a 50-50 campaign. We were doing a capital campaign, and I prayed about this, and I checked this out with our staff, and I felt like God had told me, do a 50-50 campaign. Half the money you take in, give it away to 43 different projects. And every consultant told me, you're nuts. Everyone. Every campaign consultant said, there's a reason nobody's ever done this. This is crazy. People will not give money to you if you're going to give half of it away. People will give money to bricks and mortar and churches, but they will not give money to needy causes. That you're going to crash and burn. Now, I also thought, if that's true, that's sad, isn't it? Because we're going to have really nice church buildings in America while the community goes to hell in a handbasket, and we're going to become known as the people who care about our churches, not the community, which is what we're known. And everybody told me it won't work. So we did it anyway, and it actually surpassed any other campaign we'd ever had. God's people were amazing. Here's the problem, though. When you do a 50-50 campaign, everything that comes in gets split into unleashing compassion and into stuff we need to do around here, which means some of those 43 projects didn't get done. So this year, we went, let's do another campaign. And we thought, let's do a thing, we called it Compassion First. Our theme was whatever it takes. And on the back of your outline, if you ever want to try one of these on for size in your church, on the back of your outline, we basically said this: compassion first, unleashing compassion. And see that picture of the little girl top left? I'll tell you the story of her tonight. We've got to unleash compassion. And we basically went, there's 5 huge areas. First, fight sex trafficking and poverty, and we had a bunch of projects, and it's going to total almost $500,000. Invest in local high-impact ministries. You know what happens? Most churches spend almost all of their money on themselves, okay? What's interesting is this: if they have any left over, they give it to foreign missions, which means almost all the ministries in the community that work here with the poor suffocate for money. And they're overextended and undersupported. So we're going to raise, it's actually going to be $250,000 and just flat out give it to 6 of these, including the Salvation Army, and it's a privilege. And we're also going to give it to 26 different ministries who work with the poor in this town, okay? Then third is we want to reach at-risk kids and a whole bunch of projects, and we're going to serve our entire community. That's going to cost almost $750,000 for about 8 different projects. Train the next generation of Christian leaders. That's going to be about $665,000. You know, we had 31 projects. It's going to take at least $2 million to pull these off. And we got up and said to our church, we have other things we want to do. There's 43 total things. Here's 31 of them. And we said this: if we don't get enough money to do these, we aren't doing anything until all 31 of these things are fully funded and we know they're going to happen. Does that make sense? And again, consultants told me there's no way it's going to happen. Our church doesn't find out until Mother's Day what happened, but just to let you know what's happened is we've had more, not pledges, we've had enough money come in and flat out gifts to make every single one of these things happen, and we already know it. And it was interesting because I started thinking, for some reason, God has wired people up. When people get called to service and called to compassion and the church starts putting Jesus back at the head of the table, these kind of things happen.